Shabbat Shalom. On Reddit, the website Reddit, there's a page I love called Technically the Truth, in which people share things that are both 100% factually accurate and highly misleading. For example, earlier today when I said the Maftir Aliyah was on page 855, technically it started on page 854, but it was on page 855. Technically the truth might have been a little misleading. Also, another example that I pulled from the website, did you know that after the British Army introduced metal helmets to their soldiers in World War I, they reported a dramatic increase in the rise of head injuries in combat? At first you might think, oh, the helmets were injuring the soldiers. No, the helmets were saving the soldiers because they were changing what would have been a deadly injury, to a deadly wound, to a non-deadly injury. So it's true that casualties went down, but it's equally technically true that injuries went up. The data is all the same. The difference is how you interpret it. In this week's Torah portion, we see another example where two groups take the same military information and interpret it drastically differently. God tells Moses to send these 12 tribal leaders to scout out the land, and Moses gives them specific instructions. See what kind of country it is. Are the people who dwell in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the country in which they dwell good or bad? Are the towns they live in open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? So these leaders go and scout the land, come back, give a report. And if you look at the language in the Torah, everything they say is technically 100% accurate. The people who inhabit the country are powerful. That's true. The cities are fortified and very large. Also true. We saw Anakites, Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites. Yes, those are in fact the other ancient peoples of the land. Encyclopedia Britannica couldn't have done a better job. These are the truths of what they saw. Now comes the interpretation. First, Caleb speaks, and he doesn't dispute any of the other spies' facts because they're not actually in dispute, they're truthful, but his framing of it is totally different. Ole na'aleh, let's go up, let's make aliyah, let's enter the land. Ki yachol nuchal la, we are surely capable of doing it. That's Caleb's interpretation of the data, that whatever military challenges they saw are not enough to counteract the power of God and the devotion of the Israelites. The others, however, have their own analysis. They're stronger than us. The land's going to devour us. These people are giants. We look like grasshoppers in their eyes. By the way, that's the giveaway, that they moved from speaking the truth to inserting their own interpretation. We look like grasshoppers in their eyes, because the Kotzker Rebbe points out, how would they know what they would have looked like in the eyes of somebody else? That's not even an interpretation based on objective data, because they couldn't have known the truth of how the Anakites or whoever else were perceiving them. This is just them using a negative filter to interpret or overinterpret what they saw. Negative filtering is a psychological phenomenon, a cognitive distortion, where you only focus on the negatives you can see and discount any positives you might see. This is sometimes experienced by people who are depressed. It's a self-imposed framing where you're fully aware of everything in your life that is challenging or sad or unfair, and all those things might be 100% true, but you don't also make yourself aware of all of the good things in your life. And it's incredibly tricky to pull yourself out of, because when you're in that mind state, you counter it by saying these aspects aren't actually negative, or it's not actually as hard as it feels. That trick doesn't work because they're real. They are negative things going on. They are hard. The way out, or a way out, is to force yourself to see the good that is equally true, to see what is outside your frame. Martin Scorsese says, cinema is a matter of what's in the frame and what's out. And that's certainly true of life as well. The spies saw a truth, that the land would certainly not be easy to conquer because its inhabitants truly were strong and well fortified, but they didn't give equal weight to the whole truth, to all of the positive data that they could have relied upon, and indeed that Caleb and Joshua did rely upon, that the Israelites had survived slavery, a dangerous trek through the wilderness, sustained not only by God's support, but also by their own inner reserves of faith and resiliency. The Torah that we read this week actually highlights the downsides of imposing a negative filter on yourself. It takes place after the conquest of the land. Joshua sends these spies to Jericho to scope it out. They hide on the roof of the sex worker Rahab. Why did she help them? She explains the reasoning. This is the quote: "I know that the Lord has given the country to you, because dread of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land are quaking before you. For we heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Sea of Reeds for you when you left Egypt." In other words, the spies, and by the way, each of them was the chief of a tribe, the most prominent men among the people of Israel, had filtered out the elements of truth that would have helped them see their campaign positively, while someone who was their total opposite, woman, non-Jew, someone who occupied the lowest social status in society, she was able to see the positive elements that the spies themselves had blinded themselves to. It's fitting that in Hebrew the word Rahab means wide or broad, because she was able to see the whole picture, the entire truth, unencumbered by negative framing. If only the Israelite chiefs had allowed themselves to see the positive elements of the truth the way Rahab did, they never would have had to wander the wilderness for 40 years. And if only in our own lives, in our lowest and most scared moments, if only we were able to feel about ourselves the way that others feel about us, if we were able to see the whole truth and not just the results of the negative filter, we might never have to wander our own internal wilderness for as long as we do. Some of you know, part of my master's requirements for rabbinical school, I've been studying the collection of all the Midrash material about the book of Genesis. It just so happens I came across one this week that's very fitting. According to Rabbi Simon, Midrash goes, that just before God began the process of creating Adam, the first human, the angels held a big debate. They split into two camps because half the angels tried to convince God that it would have been better if Adam had never been created at all. An argument that people struggling with this negative filtering might find eerily familiar. How it might be better if humanity was not created at all. Sometimes perhaps about themselves individually. And the other half of the angels tried to convince God that it was a good idea to create humankind. The angel of kindness said, Yibareh, let him be created, as he performs acts of kindness. The angel of truth said, Al Yibareh, let him not be created, as he is full of lies. The angel of justice said, Yibareh, let him be created, as he performs acts of justice. The angel of peace said, Al Yibareh, let him not be created, as he is full of discord. So what did the Holy One of Blessing do? God took the angel of truth and hurled it onto the ground, onto the earth. And spoiler alert, Adam was created. And eventually so were we all. Each of these angels were telling the truth. It is true that humans can be kind and perform acts of tzedakah, acts of justice. And it is true that humans can lie and cause disputes. We can understand why in this Midrash guide sides with the angels who says, let him be created. But why do we need the Midrash to tell us that God hurled the angel of truth to the ground? In the words of Rabbi Irving Filler, a truth, be it ever so honest and accurate, but whose logical conclusion is al yibareh, don't create, don't do, must be rejected. And indeed, that's a good way to tell whether your perception is influenced by negative framing. It's whether it's influencing you towards stasis rather than growth. That your framework is in a way working for you because it's keeping you stuck, and the human mind almost always prefers the comfort of the familiar to the fear of growing into something new. And so, of course, it makes sense that the spies' negative framework led them to the conclusion that it would be better to go back to Egypt because Egypt was familiar. Going back to being enslaved would mean that they wouldn't have to make the difficult choices that free people have to make all the time. It might have been physically hard, but it would have seemed in a certain light emotionally easier. And mind almost always wins over matter. It's impossible for a person to have no cognitive biases, to never, ever have any negative framing. But if we are going to have a bias when we try to interpret the truth, we should have a bias towards hope. The same hope that Caleb and Joshua had when they said, Yachol nuchal, we are definitely able to do it, to fully claim our place in the land of Israel. And to be clear, this bias towards hope is not the same thing as optimism. These are two very different things. There's a paper by researchers at Wright State University in Ohio, and it argues that they're two very different psychological phenomena. Quote, the optimistic person believes that somehow, either through luck, the actions of others, one own actions, somehow his or her future will be successful and fulfilling. The hopeful person, on the other hand, believes specifically in his or her own capability for securing a successful and fulfilling future. End quote. It'd be one thing for Caleb and Joshua to be optimistic and say, God saved us in Egypt. Surely God will save us as we enter the land of Israel. But that's not what happened. Caleb was hopeful. Yachol nuchal, we can do it. We can do it. National anthem of Israel is not ha-optimism. It's hatikva, the hope. Yes, we can have optimistic faith that somewhere, someplace, help will come, perhaps that God will help us. But what matters, in Hebrew, od lo avda tikvatenu, that we have not lost hope in ourselves, that we maintain our hope and our confidence in our own abilities, that when we look at the truth, we frame it through the lens of hope. And so the sin of the spies, the great tragedy that consigned the Israelites to wander the wilderness for 40 years, not so much that they didn't have faith in God, although that was definitely an element, it was that they didn't have faith in themselves. Their cognitive biases and negative framing had so colored their sense of self that they thought it would have been better to have died in Egypt, because at least there, their futures would have been predictably bad rather than unpredictably bad, never considering the possibility that they might be capable of doing great things. Only Joshua and Caleb and Rahab, the non-Jewish ally, were able to see the whole truth. Only they demonstrated the crucial human need to have a bias for hope. In our own lives, as the world seems ever darker, it can be harder than ever to see the light that is always around us. The Torah is telling us this week, and in particular this week, that when we see only the cracks, we need to also see the light that comes through them. That when everything seems hopeless, we are commanded to hope, which means that we are commanded to believe in ourselves and to help others see the good in themselves. Because as this week's parsha says, Yachol nuchal, we can do it. And that is the truth. Shabbat shalom.